Nebuchadnezzar's dream to him. But the interpretation that was given by Daniel was a prophecy concerning Nebuchadnezzar and the kingdoms that would come after him. And some think, and we studied that last week, that the great image that he built, the golden image, we figure was made out of wood and overlaid with gold and different things, was based on the image that he saw in his dream. So it was meant to bring glory to King Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom, and always expanding really his domain there over all the known world at that time of our lesson this morning. But when parents tell their children to do certain chores, okay, like maybe washing up for dinner, wash your hands before you eat, maybe picking up your clothes, cleaning up your room, keeping things in order. I know Jeff was talking the other week at Mom's and how he couldn't have but one toy at a time. And that's pretty much was the case for me. If I got my cars out, that's all I could have out at the time to play with. And when you were done playing with those toys, you had to put them up. And she's since then taught the grandkids if they go in the garage and get. It often goes with all the other children as well. If you have siblings within the home, they all have certain chores that they have to do or supposed to do. And sometimes maybe one sibling or the other has to remind one another of the tasks that were given to them, right? If the dishes had to be washed or clothes thrown in the washer or dryer, you get the point. But when one isn't helping to do their part, it seems like you have to remind that one, if we don't do this, Mom said we couldn't do that or this or Dad, whatever. And sometimes they refuse to listen, right? The other sibling might refuse to listen. Or they'll find an excuse not to do something or do so right. Maybe get in an argument, But when you add the words that Mom said or Dad said, right? That gives it an authority to it, right? So we have to do this to put that authority behind the words. And as soon as you say that, it makes a difference. It gets that one that's being a little lazy. It gets them up off their posterior and gets them to moving, right? Gets them to helping. And so this lesson this week, we see that Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they're going to speak about God's authority, the authority that he has. Because God's instructions to them and to us not to bow down or worship any other thing or person was the final authority, right? He has the all power. And so it would be terrifying for us today if we would refuse a king or someone that has earthly authority over us to take our life. It would be maybe a terrifying, or fear may come over us. We probably would have that type of feeling, but thank goodness we're not really faced with that type of situation, at least not as of yet anyway. But we are still expected to have this type of bold faith that these three men here had. We're expected to be faithful to God enough to follow those commands there, not to worship any other gods or all of his commandments. And we have to do that because he's the only one who is truly, really in charge, right? And so today we're going to see that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be astonished by God's power, because he's going to recognize the omnipotence of God. Because in our lesson last week, he was telling those three Hebrew boys that there wasn't no God that was going to be powerful enough to save them from that fiery furnace, right? He was even showing his ego there, thinking that all of his false and gods and idols were the powerful ones, that this God that they were worshiping themselves, that they wouldn't bow down to another, wasn't powerful enough to save them out of his hand. But he's going to realize here in our lesson today that he's met his match, right? So we'll begin with chapter 3, verse 19. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake, and he commanded that they should heat the furnace 17 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. It's telling us there that Nebuchadnezzar was furious, right, at the response of these three Hebrew men. He was upset last week because he found out by the tattletales that he had three that he had put in charge over some providence that wouldn't bow down and worship his idol. And so he was even more full of fury now because he gave them a second chance in our lesson last week to bow down and worship those idols, and he would not cast them into this fiery furnace. He had to go ahead with what he'd said he would do if he found someone not obeying his command to worship this idol and his gods. He already said he would throw them into a fiery furnace. They would be punished. So he couldn't go back on his word, because if he did, he wouldn't be as held as high regard as what he was, right? People would not fear him anymore. He would lose his grip, his authority, and his power over the kingdom there. And so his command was perfectly clear, right? In his rage, it says he has this furnace stoked to 7 times hotter than normal. Maybe in his wild and fury thinking, it would make the men suffering worse, right? But he summoned his most mightiest and strongest soldiers here. And we're going to read on down in 21. He's going to tie these guys up. He's going to bind them up and cast them into this fiery furnace. And we probably can't help but wonder when we're reading this about these 3 Hebrew boys, men last week and this week. We can't help but wonder, maybe within our own human mind, it's just the way it is. It's the way we are. Why God would allow these 3 faithful men to go through this trial or this test. Right? We're often faced with trials and tests within our own life. Sickness come, disease come, whatever the case may be, it's a trial for us, right? We're all human. We're all faced with different things. We don't know a lot of times what people are going through, right? Because we may not have gone through that way, or we may not have been down to that low point. So it's hard for us to understand, right? We can't hardly put ourselves in their shoes if we've not been through it. But I think a lot of my parents with this morning and the other day when I was getting this lesson together, because both of them have been so faithful to serve God, right? All of their lives, really, because they come in December, they've been married, they'll be married 60 years, and so that's a long time. And Dad's been pastoring, been preaching for over 50 years, probably more like 55, probably really close to 60 years himself, because he began preaching before him and Mom really got married, or about that time. So he's been preaching 60 years, been serving God even when he was a young boy. He talks all the time and tells us how many times he got saved about every week, because back then there was a lot of fire and brimstone preaching going on. Maybe we need a lot more of that today instead of this tickle my ear, make me feel good and all that stuff, and Dad, he does preach the Word of God, and he does preach that fire and brimstone, because there's no other way to make it to heaven without you being saved, right? And so, but both of them have been children, It couldn't have been too easy, maybe. We're not that bad. I'm just trying to make y'all smile a little bit to help me get through this without tearing up and crying. So I like to be a little bit of a comedian like Rick. And so there's been some tests, there's been some trials, within your own lives, right, of raising children. So, and then you look at all the things that run a church, right, to keep the church going, to keep the doors open, to go visit this one and call this one and all those things. I've seen that where Dad would work and come home and change his clothes and jump in the truck, car, or whatever, and drive to Winston or Duke or Charlotte or wherever, because a church member had called. They were in the hospital, or a loved one want him to come and see and visit and pray for them. And so he's done that all of his life. And then he's had Mom, right? She's just stuck together like glue. It's like peanut butter and jelly, okay? she prays for Dad and all of us, all of you in the church, all of her family, and of course her husband, Dad, fervently prays for him. And so they've worked together all these years, but yet both of them are facing some tough trials. They've faced some over the years, just 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago now, but Mom was faced with her heart valve. We had to get it fixed. They repaired it, the Lord moved, and she's done really, really good for 20 years. Now she's faced with another. But in that time, Dad was faced with his own heart trouble, just 4 years after Mom the first time. God's brought him through it. He's been with them. He's heard the prayers. He's been faithful to them, right? Because of their faithfulness, I believe. Because of their commitment to him. And then, now it seems here again, and Dad's been faced with battling cancer for the last 4 months. We were hoping that wasn't what it was, right? But it turned out to be so. But he said, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to fight. The Lord is going to be with him, and he has been. Dad's done really, really good for the last 4 months. Yeah, he's tired. Yeah, he's had his good days. He's had his bad days. But he keeps going. He don't stop. And then Mom, 2 weeks ago yesterday, we were all hit with the brain bleed and the stroke and all that she's been going through. It's a fiery trial, is what I'm using that for an illustration. That's a fiery trial for them, and it's a fiery trial for us too, because we're right in the midst of it with them, doing all we can to help them and encourage them and be by their side and fight with them. But their faith and ours has really been tested, and it's been tried. The devil attempts every which way possible to destroy our faith, right? He works to do that. And we know of Job. You hear about the story of Job. I was talking about it this morning to Brother Danny. He called me a while ago. How he was tested, right? Job was tested. He lost his family, lost his home, lost all of he had, right? He never lost sight, though, of his commitment to serving God and believing and trusting in him. Even though his wife told him, said, why don't you just give up and curse your God and die? He said, no, right? He said, yet though God slay me, I'm still going to trust him. Neither has my parents or us, for that matter. We've never given up. We're still trusting. We're still believing. I believe God tests us to develop our faith sometimes, right? To give us a stronger faith, a deeper faith. Because a faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. A false faith or a fake relationship with Jesus Christ this morning, it withers, right? It'll wither away in the face of a trial. It'll get down in the fetal position and just hide, it won't come out. If we have that deep faith, that deep-rooted faith, the true faith in God, it only grows, right? It only gets stronger, and it takes a deeper root, right? If you want a plant to grow, it has to get a deeper root, right? You get a deeper root of faith, and it brings all the glory to God. It don't bring you the glory, right? That's not what it's designed for. It brings all the glory and honor to him. And so old Nebuchadnezzar's ego here, it was showing to us in these first two verses. He demanded to heat that furnace 7 times hotter. He demanded to be respected. He demanded to be honored, right? Because he gave an order and a command for them to bow down. And if they didn't, this is what he was going to do. So he had to go through with it. And so verse 21, then these men were bound in their coats and their hosen and their hats and their other garments and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So now it's telling us there, the 3 Hebrew men, they were bound. They probably had some fancy garments maybe. They probably had some real fancy duds on because they were important, because they were over some providences. But none of that mattered. He wanted these men bound, right? He wanted them tied. He wanted them bound every which way that they couldn't do anything. Once they threw them in the fire, that was pretty much it, right? And he threw them in the midst of the fire, not the outskirts of the fire, but in the midst of the fire. In the midst of that fire, that's where it's the hottest, right? And so they were bound with their hats and their coats, and he tied them up really good so they couldn't do anything to try and escape to get out of that fiery furnace once they were thrown in. And these mighty soldiers, they obeyed Nebuchadnezzar, right? They did exactly what the king told them. They led these men to their deaths, really throwing them right into the midst of that furnace. But however, when those men that threw them in, as they approached the heat from that furnace, it was so intense that the soldiers were killed by the flames and by the heat that was coming from it, okay? If that hadn't happened, if it hadn't killed those men, then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego coming out of that fire wouldn't have meant nothing to us, because it didn't hurt them soldiers. It was no big deal. But the soldiers just got to the edge of that fire, and it slew and killed them. So that made it to where there was no way you could not believe that God brought them out of that furnace. The people there, they seen the heat and the fire of those flames kill those soldiers. Okay? And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into those flames, their hands and their feet bound and fully clothed. Some people think maybe they left the clothes on to really incinerate the fire. I don't know. But the irony of what was supposed to happen to these three Hebrew men happened to the soldiers. They obeyed the king's command, but yet they were the ones that were burnt to death. They were the ones that died so far. The king's great fury here, it led to the loss of some of his best warriors, some of his best soldiers that he had. The mighty men who had cast and who had won many battles and fights for the kingdom of Babylon had just died at the king's own furnace, at his own fire, his own flame. It had took them. The mighty man had cast those three Hebrew boys into the furnace to carry out this order by the king, were burned to death. In Psalm 68, verses 1 through 2, let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. Let them also that hate him flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so drive them away. As wax melteth before the fire, so let the wicked perish at the presence of God. Let the God of our faith this morning arise within us this morning. It brings the things the devil does to try to harm us and try to make us lose our faith. Let the enemies of that be scattered. Resist the devil and he will flee, right? Just to help out the heat, to put this heat in perspective, this furnace, I'm trying to hurry too much because I don't want to run out of time. A brick kiln in that time, in that era, would roughly reach about 1,832 degrees, okay, Fahrenheit. So the temperature of this furnace being made 7 times hotter puts that at about 12,824 degrees Fahrenheit. Now this is 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the surface of the sun. So that furnace was pretty hot, right? I believe the presence of God, though, was there at the very entrance of that furnace. And the enemies were slain by the very presence of God. He slain the enemies, right? We just read there in Psalms, let them be slew before him, right? So he slew the enemies, those warriors, those soldiers that were throwing his servants, that his faithful servants into that fire. He protected them and he slew the enemies. He took care of them. The presence of God was there. God's presence was already with the Hebrew men, right? They would have perished just as the warriors did, right? They would have died right then too, had God not been with them, had he not be there to protect them. So how many of us would say this morning, I may be getting close to the flames, right? I may be getting close to the flames of my trial, but God is already here. He's already here with me to protect me from the fire. His presence is already here. I can feel maybe that rush of angels' wings, right, coming to my side. I can face the trial boldly. Why? With faith, my God will deliver me from the hands of my enemies. He'll deliver me from the problems that I'm facing, just like he delivered the children of Israel with Moses at the Red Sea. He delivered them, right? He delivered them out of Pharaoh's hand. They got to the sea. They thought, well, we're going to die, right? It's over. But God parted the Red Sea. They walked across on dry land. When they got across and Pharaoh and his army tried it, what happened? Here come the water. They all drowned. They all died. The enemies got perished. They were slew. Why? Because of the